I'm your host Blob, and this is Blabspike. In today's episode, we're talking about the design space of concepts in various games. If you fancy this type of content, or you just fancy me, like the video, leave a comment, subscribe, hit the bell, do all that jazz. And of course, if you just want to read the article I'm narrating from, check out the link in the description. This podcast serves as a companion piece to another podcast I've done labeled Giving Space to Design Space. I'll be going over some mini case studies of specific aspects of various games, ruminating on how the game approached and explored that specific thing's design space, why designers might have gone that route, and where it could possibly go in future iterations. These will mostly be evaluations and conclusions I've come to after using the tools and strategies from the aforementioned podcast. Obviously, I'm an outsider looking in, so I have absolutely zero clue about the inner workings and intentions of the design team behind these games and their decisions. However, this specific podcast is an exercise in observing specific aspects of projects and media I engage with. Keep in mind that evaluations of one very specific aspect of a game does not carry any meritorious judgment about that individual aspect, and certainly not about the game as a whole. First, let's cover the Brave Point system from Bravely Default and Bravely Second. To summarize, Bravely Default and Bravely Second are fairly traditional JRPGs in many ways. Characters and enemies enter an instance of turn-based combat, where a speed stat determines the sequence that actions are taken between characters. However, the Bravely Default series introduces BP, or Brave Points. Most actions require one Brave Point to take. When a character's turn would come up, they gain 1 BP, and if they have 0 or more BP, they can take an action. They effectively skip their turn if they remain in the negatives. If each involved character or enemy only takes one action each of their turns, the game is not very different than most traditional turn-based combat games. However, this is where Brave and Default come in. By defaulting, a character enters a defensive stance and doesn't consume a BP. This allows them to bank BP for future use up to a total of 3. Brave is the act of using extra BP during a character's turn to take additional actions. There are some caveats though. That character can only take up to 4 total actions. They can choose how many actions they take, and they can't Brave if it would put them lower than -3 BP. BP, Brave, and Default are pretty cool innovations on a fairly played out genre. However, it mostly is just a resource system with a fairly small range, and I'm confident in saying that its space is narrow to medium, probably leaning closer to medium. The actual ability to alter these major actions is fairly shallow. Change up how much BP is gained, make different actions cost different amounts of BP, and that's it really. However, the system is used in a couple of cute ways. 1. It gives players a major amount of agency by allowing them to guarantee powerful combinations of actions rather than do one, then hope a whole turn cycle passes and they can take another action. 2. Enemy characters can also take advantage of Brave and Default. 3. BP modulation via conditional effects or specific abilities do spice up encounters. And lastly, some skills and attacks care about how much BP a character has or how much is being used in the moment. While there's not a whole lot you can do with the system in terms of tinkering, it manages to find a great importance for itself in many other mechanics and systems. And honestly, it's a great joy when you realize you can take 4 actions at 3 BP, then take more actions on the following turn since you'd be set at 0. I'm honestly struggling to imagine other scenarios this system can be utilized. And to be clear, a series having explored a majority of what its innovative system can do is not a slight on the system whatsoever. If anything, that's being efficient. When I complete Bravely Default 2, I may add an addendum if it manages to surpass my expectations in this field. Next, let's talk about stat distribution in MapleStory. Whenever a character levels up in MapleStory, they get a variety of points to put into stats or skills. Since MapleStory has undergone many iterations throughout the years, we'll be specifically talking about old school MapleStory, where characters get 5 ability points and 3 skill points each time they get a level. Skill points are used to unlock and power up skills, whereas AP is used to improve HP, MP, Strength, Dex, Int, and Luck stats, which all have different effects on damage output and secondary stats like accuracy. The primary stats, Strength, Dex, Int, and Luck, are also used for requirements on some equipment and certain metagaming strategies. The concept and intent of stat distribution has incredibly wide design space, but how it manifests within MapleStory is actually pretty narrow by comparison. Unfortunately, while the system has a lot of cool role-playing elements, most of the actual gameplay ramifications incentivize stat check gameplay. Your character must meet specific requirements for the role to have a reasonable chance of clearing content without making you pull your hair out. An example of this is having a minimum amount of HP to survive attacks a boss can do. If a boss can deal 5,000 damage and you only have 2,000 HP, you'll probably never defeat that boss. Similarly, if an entire party deals 1 million damage per minute and the boss has 100 million HP, you better be ready to stay there for 100 minutes at minimum. And to be clear, MapleStory does do quite a few cute things. Most jobs have a secondary primary stat, such as standard magician equipment having a luck stat requirement, despite the job relying on int for a majority of its damage formula. Bandits, and their eventual fourth job counterpart, Shadower, actually want a mix of luck, strength, and dex for optimal builds. Dragon Knights, a fourth job counterpart of warriors, primarily uses strength with dex to cover equipment requirements and accuracy needs, but there existed a mostly theoretical build that primarily used luck to improve avoidability, so low-level mobs could be farmed more easily. I think it's pretty obvious that MapleStory could have given a lot more depth to stat distribution than it did. Several other games actually have, and to make it incredibly clear, my intent with this mini case is to highlight that 1. A design does not always need to explore every nook and cranny of its potential, and 2. Different designs can go into different games with dramatically different executions and effects. Let's talk about the note highway from O2 Jam. The note highway is the area that notes travel while songs play. Once they reach a certain area, players have to press a corresponding button to score points and avoid failing. They also get more points if they are more accurate. Depending on the song, notes will travel much further. Additionally, players can choose to increase the speed of the notes. Otherwise, O2 Jam does not really do much else with the note highway. O2 Jam explores the note highway in an extremely narrow fashion. It really didn't need to expand on what a note highway could do, especially for its time. After all, a lot of the game's draw is song choice, dressing up anime-styled avatars, and being a social lobby experience. Players will mostly interact with the note highway for aesthetic purposes, such as swapping out themes, or by making the notes slower and faster for challenge modulation. Note highways are in an interesting place. They mostly want to be clear and simple since that works well with the gameplay of rhythm games, O2 Jam included. But we've seen a fair number of innovations throughout the years, including invisible notes, notes that swap tracks on the highway, different ways to draw notes on the highway, and different shapes for the highway, including formless ones like in Beat Saber. One innovation I enjoy is sliding notes that move diagonally across the highway. While I'm not certain the design space of note highways as a concept is wide, there's definitely more stuff to do. If it hasn't happened yet, I'd like to see multi-track drifting. Next, wildcards from Uno. In Uno, each player takes turns playing cards that match a quality of the most recently played card, color, numerical value, or symbol, until one player has no more cards. Wildcards are special cards that can be played regardless of the most recent card's qualities and is treated as any color of the player's choice. Wildcards are used very simply in Uno, and for good reason. People are usually playing Uno to have a fun time, not a think time. The main iteration on wildcards are wild draw 4s, which determines a color and forces the next player to draw 4 cards. However, recent sets have released decks with wild shuffles and wild customizable cards. While customizable cards are just cheating when viewed from the lens of evaluating design space, I think it's safe to say that wildcards have an extremely high potential in terms of design space just by definition. There are plenty of iterations that I can list off the top of my head, and dozens of others I can make up if given the time. For example, a wild symbol card. Maybe a colored card that gives a wildcard choice to the next player. How about a wildcard that is limited to a few modes? Let's mosey on up to the weapon triangle from the Fire Emblem series. Units in Fire Emblem fight using weapons they hold. Depending on what weapon they have relative to the enemy, their stats might raise or lower. Different games have different exact bonuses and introduce different relationships among available weapons, though they usually slot into a rock, paper, scissors scenario. The series as a whole explores weapon triangles in a variety of cute ways. There are weapons that specifically reverse the relationship, skills that embolden or nullify them, and multiple weapon triangles that coexist. The weapon triangle also gives direction on how units can be developed and utilized. A class can be evaluated more highly if it gets access to certain weapon types, or can swap weapons to gain an advantage on any enemy it comes across. Challenge-wise, these qualities are also utilized. In many games, early bosses often have axes, which are naturally weak to swords, which the main Lord character will often utilize. While the base gameplay of weapon triangles is pretty linear and narrow, and a lot of the designed gameplay scenarios will reflect that, I want to give credit where credit is due. The Fire Emblem series does explore the design space at a pretty decent depth. Rock, paper, scissors systems as a whole have incredibly wide design space, though Fire Emblem's weapon triangles are mostly just bonuses to accuracy and or damage. Introducing things like different classes being affected by the weapon triangle in different ways, an expanded web of weapon relationships like type advantages in Pokemon, or different advantages to be gained by the weapon triangle are just a small list of possibilities. While I haven't played Fire Emblem Engage, my cursory research found that the weapon triangle was given an additional bonus of inflicting a status if the attacker had an advantage. Let's talk the blade combo system in Xenoblade Chronicles 2. During combat in Xenoblade Chronicles 2, characters charge up specials that are quick-time events with some sort of utility, usually damage. Specials can be charged up to level 3, though some blades have a level 4 special. Blades also have an element that determines their special's element. Blade combos occur when a special is used and another blade combo is not already in progress. To progress through a blade combo, a flowchart must be followed using specials of a specific element and a minimum level. For example, Mega Explosion occurs when a minimum level 1 fire special is used, then a minimum level 2 fire special is used within a fairly generous time frame, followed up by a minimum level 3 fire special. Other element specials can be used during a blade combo, but if they do not meet element or level requirements, they do not advance the blade combo. If a blade combo is not advanced during the available time frame, the blade combo fails and another one can begin. Successfully completing a blade combo does a few things. A large amount of damage is done, an elemental orb is generated on the enemy based on the last element, and depending on the element, a certain aspect of combat is sealed. Mega Explosion creates a fire element orb, which also seals self-destruct. Elemental orbs are used to inflict massive amounts of damage during chain attacks. Blade combos are obviously fairly constrained by the designed flowcharts, so in that sense, the system is narrow. The flowchart combinations never change throughout the game, and neither do the outcomes of finishing them. However, many mechanics, general combat flow, and a great deal of party building considerations are inextricably linked to blade combos. As a result, blade combos end up being more of a glue rather than anything truly exciting. As a whole, Xenoblade Chronicles 2's combat systems just has so many exciting things that are competing with each other. Each special has its own cutscene, special effects, and branch in the blade's skill tree. Additionally, each art needs to be timed and potentially comboed with. And of course, chain attacks are a major aspect of combat, especially later in the game, and more naturally becomes the trump card of any given combat encounter. Blade combos are in a strange position of they can definitely mix things up, but is the cognitive burden it places on designers and players worth it? An immediate iteration would be a sprawling map of different blade combo routes, maybe even different combos having different routes depending on the character. However, would that actually be fun? There might be a demographic for it, but I imagine that the research necessary to make a functional team that feels optimal would be a high barrier to the general audience, which would make them give up on the system entirely. Would allowing players to freestyle blade combos lead to more interesting gameplay? Funnily enough, the DLC, Torna the Golden Country, does exactly this, with some other changes as well. The primary one being player-determined character elements. Freestyle blade combos were less interesting to myself. I enjoyed the puzzle nature of making sure I could get through each blade combo route. Having the system be so blasé cooled me off on the system a little bit. I'm not sure if blade combos could pick up some changes without compromising its core appeal. However, I do think that chain attacks in Xenoblade Chronicles 3 picks up where blade combos left off. Rather than worry about elements, it instead worries about the character's class type, and each character gets a fun little bonus that is unique to them. Additionally, instead of having to micromanage special charges with an extremely chaotic user interface, many of the decision tree choices occur during the stop-and-go chain attack sequences instead. Did you know that Super Mario Bros. 2 is actually a reskin of a game called Doki Doki Panic, where they had the mechanic of picking things up? In Super Mario Bros. 2, players could pick up items off the ground or the things they were standing on, including enemies, and lift it above their heads. Afterwards, they could drop the item or throw it to the left or to the right in an arc. Given that this game was released in the NES era and is actually a reskin of another game, we can't be too harsh on how simply this mechanic played out. Generally, it served to aid a sense of discovery by hiding random items behind tufts of grass, or it served as a method of delivering one item from point A to point B. In terms of combat, picking up objects to throw them at enemies involves the player with environmental factors and adds the thrill of preparing and lining up shots. One ramification of this mechanic is it necessitated that characters could stand atop or ride the things that they pick up, including enemies and potential projectiles. In the context of the Mario series up to that point, that was actually a pretty refreshing take on the character-platform-enemy relationship. Picking things up is a universal concept, so I'm not really sure where to go from here. Plenty of games have iterated on this concept, with things such as picked up items cursing or blessing the player while held, giving more things to do with the held items besides a singular throw trajectory, and diversifying or specifying what can be picked up. If we look at the Mario series, this mechanic returns immediately in Super Mario Bros. 3, though the implementation required Mario to essentially be running the whole time as a quote-unquote trade-off. Fans of custom levels and speedruns of Super Mario Bros. 3, Super Mario World, and various Super Mario Maker levels might recall creative tech and uses of picking up items. Let's scout ahead with Legends of Runeterra and the Scout mechanic. In Legends of Runeterra, players are given an attack token at the start of each round in an alternating order. A player with an attack token can use the token and an action to send a lineup of units to attack. Scout is a keyword mechanic that means the first time each round that exclusively allies with Scout attack, rally, and rally is a keyword that means you get an attack token. In layman's terms, if your attacking lineup only has units with Scout, you get another free attack for the round. Scout has a lot of connections with several of Legend of Runeterra's systems and mechanics, especially in regards to moment-to-moment scenarios. The obvious one is Scout incentivizes the attacking player to have as many Scout units as possible so they can attack with the maximum amount of units they can afford each round. At the same time, Scout can also be used as a scouting action. Attack with an already developed board presence to present aggression your opponent might not be ready for and still have an attack left in the tank. Some silly ways to play with this mechanic is mixing in Rally to have a silly attack sequence like attack, rally, play some scout units, scout attack, attack. Scout didn't get too many quote-unquote fun designs, and most of its initial batch of cards were basic units that had slightly subpar stat lines or an additional effect. However, there was a small theme of units with Scout that had Challenger or granted vulnerable to enemy units. These skills allowed your units to force other units to block them. In this scenario, Scout greatly benefited the player if those units could survive Scout combat and fight an additional time. In terms of deck strategies, one that stands out to me were Misfortune decks that wanted a high number of declared attacks. Scout is a perfect synergy in this scenario. Like many TCG mechanics, Scout never really had a resurgence or a batch of releases that further utilized the mechanic. There are obviously a lot of permutations of mechanics and themes Scout could have been stapled onto, but it was probably decided that they weren't viable for one reason or another. Personally, I'd like to have seen a theme about mixing Ephemeral and Scout, units with Ephemeral dive to survive combat or at the end of a round. But I'd probably have to agree that there aren't too many ways to retool Scout in a meaningful way. Okay, time to speed up a little bit. Let's talk about boost in Sonic Generations. During the quote-unquote modern levels, Sonic has a boost gauge with an energy resource. By using up energy, Sonic can boost and gain a notable increase in speed and damage enemies and obstacles without taking damage or slowing down. Energy can be gained by performing tricks or gathering rings. A notable aspect of boosting is the sudden acceleration and higher maximum running speed. Additionally, Sonic's turning radius becomes much wider to the point that drifting becomes necessary to make turns that Google Maps would describe as a slight left or right. However, Sonic does get a sidestep maneuver for minor repositioning. Play-wise, boost is very basic, and it's used in very basic ways. It's mostly on demand, and energy is relatively easy to obtain and manage. There's a very visceral game feel from boosting that can only be explained as gotta go fast. Without much to tweak in terms of input or output, a lot of design iterations around boosts necessarily have to focus on the challenges instead. Can players maintain control and mastery of Sonic's movement during the boost? Can they manage the energy resource optimally? Are there timing challenges based on using the boost correctly? And so on and so forth. Boosting is just very cool, and its appeal and usage has been utilized by games for decades for a reason. Nitro boosts in racing games are always a hoot, and Sonic has had boost pads to speed up the blue blur for decades. However, I think the 3D boost era Sonic games showcase something important. Regardless of how viable a mechanic or system is in terms of critical reception and enjoyment, a design that strains the project can be a detriment. The ramifications of having boost be a viable mechanic restrains enemies and level designs in a variety of ways. First, how do you design a glut of enemies that can challenge boost in fair and interesting ways? Even if you look at just boss designs, how many are just dodge until you can boost into a weak spot? One of boost's appeals is that boosting utterly demolishes standard enemies, and even if it didn't, boost allows Sonic to avoid contact completely. In terms of level design, having to accommodate that vast distance Sonic can cover in a 3D environment while keeping it fun has to be a monumental task in terms of hardware and planning. I think this shows up quite a bit in later levels. The interwoven roller coasters of Chemical Plant and Speed Highway start to deteriorate as Planet Wisp enters the horizon, and is almost completely gone by the time of Sonic Forces. The last concept I want to talk about is Companion in Magic the Gathering. Companion is a keyword that allows a player from out of the game, in sanctioned play it resides in your sideboard, to be played as long as your deck follows some sort of restriction. These restrictions ranged from things such as all creatures in your deck must have certain subtypes to all non-land permanents in your deck must be mana value 3 or greater. However, the mechanic famously received a mechanical errata. Rather than being played from out of the deck, players can pay 3 generic mana at sorcery speed to add that companion to their hand. Power level and balance controversies aside, how exactly did Companion's existence affect design, and why were the existing batch of companions designed the way they were? There were 10 companions, one for each distinct 2-color pair. Each companion had a varied and distinct deck building restriction that promoted novel, limited, and casual constructed strategies. However, the design of each companion had to fit within a pretty narrow space. The deck building restriction had to be clear and easily verifiable. Each companion had to be exciting and splashy, because this could, and now most likely would, be the only time a batch of companions would be printed. And it had to be a full cycle of legendary creatures for color wheel aesthetics reasons, and presumably for commander format purposes. While Companion will most likely never have a real card printed again, outside of maybe Modern Horizons styled shenanigans, I think Companion has a ton of space to work with. I think the primary essence of Companion isn't deck building restrictions that net you a creature, but rather pre-decided objective to fulfill and its reward. Here is an example. Companion. When a blue creature with mana 7 value or higher enters the battlefield under your control, you may pay 3 mana to put this card in your hand from outside the game if this is your chosen companion. Even less radical departures like extremely simple deck building restrictions or less "look at me, I'm such a good designer" companions would go a long way to allowing this mechanic to successfully coexist within the game of Magic. I want to see the 7-mana vanilla 1/1 companion that people strawmanned into oblivion when misplacing their anger of Luris and Urion onto Karuga or Lutri. It's not difficult to imagine a world with 50 plus companions that fit the Pokemon aesthetic Ikoria was obviously going for. To be clear, whether you or the Magic audience wants that is a different story entirely. I tried to cover as many different genres of games and mechanics and systems as I could, though I was more or less limited by things I knew I could talk at minimum length about. It's my hope that these mini case studies serve as examples of personal observations and lessons you can peer from games and media you engage with. To end things off, I'd like to mention that the 10 things I covered were partly decided from wanting a mix of wide, medium, and narrow design space, covering a mix of mechanics, groups, and systems, and whether I considered that thing explored or unexplored within the context of the game or series. For those itching to dig a little deeper, I found these categories to be a helpful framework to squeeze a deeper understanding of how I felt about certain aspects of the things I was evaluating. And here's a bit of engagement bait. Separate from my own evaluations, how would you rate the concepts in this podcast within these criteria? Adios.